Welcome everybody to the Resilience at Risk webinar series. This is our final installment of the 4-part series. We hope you've enjoyed all the previous 3, and we're lucky enough to have Professor Meg Keane join us here for the final one. Just a reminder, this is a collaboration and is brought to you jointly by the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, where I'm based, Professor Meg Keane at the Australia Pacific Security College, the University of New South Wales, and the NGO Seeds India. Now, if you've tuned in for the others or have seen some of the recordings, we've been taking on the challenges of these compounding crises, including the current pandemic, that have laid bare a lot of the progress that we've made in resilience being now at risk, And so we focused on various things throughout these 4 series. One, I started talking about the combination of the planetary health crisis exacerbating the current pandemic. It was followed by Dr. Anshu Sharma talking about the informal market collapse due to the lockdowns and restrictive policies that have been done, sometimes in knee-jerk fashion, to the pandemic. And then the last session that we had was from Professor David Sanderson talking about the role that corruption plays in exacerbating and laying the groundwork for many of the crises that we have. Fortunately, today we're joined by Professor Meg Keane, who is the director of the Australia Pacific Security College at the Australia National University, to help bring us out of that. She's going to help launch us out of this discussion of risk and into some of the bright spots using very real examples that might show how we can put resilience back on track and maybe even become stronger as a result of this pandemic and some of the things that she's seen. She brings a world of experience, decades of expertise, and a lot of deep knowledge specifically about the Asia Pacific. So we'll get a treat in terms of that. Now, I just want to remind you guys that this is interactive. We will start with a brief 15 minutes as a little discussion, and then we will move straight towards your questions. So don't hesitate. Please start asking these questions right into the chat box there. And I will start bringing them up as they come up when Professor Meg Keane is done with her initial introduction. In addition, this will be recorded for later viewing, and you can share that link with your colleagues and friends as needed. And I also want to set the final reminder that this is all in run-up to the Urban Resilience in Asia Pacific Conference that will be coming up December 3rd and 4th. Now, we had planned to have it live in person, but fortunately, we were able to transition to an all online version, and registration is now free, so it's open to everybody. So please go to the website. The instructions and links are here on this registration page for this series, and join us for what we hope will be an incredible conference. Now, without further ado, please take it away, Meg.
Good morning, or Lester, it's morning in Australia, which is where I am, and I realize everybody's spread all over the world, but welcome and thank you for coming along. As Ronak has said, what we really want to do with this one is look for some of the positive initiatives that are going on around the world in the face of COVID and cyclones and fires and all the calamities that are happening. And what can we learn? What takes us forward? Because that's what's really important. I would also say that I want to do a bit of a twist. And while you can, I'm going the wrong way, but anyway, wherever your chat box is, you can pop in your questions, your comments. I'd also encourage you, if you have some inspiring story that you've written as a blog, or you've read as a blog, or an article, or a report, put the link into that chat area as well. So we not only have a talk, we have a building resources of inspiration that we're sharing together. And that can happen afterwards as well. But I think this is really important, this idea of brokering knowledge and sharing knowledge in order for us all to move forward. What I wanted to do is to begin telling you a story about what could have been an absolute disaster tragedy was, but we've really pulled out some important lessons from what has occurred in the Pacific Islands. Now, I know this may not be familiar to everybody, so I will ask Aaron just to put up, I'm only going to put 3 slides up, but I just want to give you mental images of what we're talking about and where we're going today. So the Pacific Island countries, they're a bit like the Caribbean. They're small island countries. So Aaron, we can just put that map up. that shows they're sandwiched between Australia and United States. There's about 25 countries and territories. And like the Caribbean and other small island states, they're highly vulnerable to climate change, cyclones, droughts, flooding, etc. And what happened, and then of course they have development challenges, which are always there, adding to these problems of isolated communities, small narrow economies, and poor services because of the developing nature of their countries. So when COVID hit, like all the rest of us, there had to be a decision on what to do, and they tightly shut their borders down. This was because they knew what a pandemic could bring. At the turn of the century, some of them lost a quarter of their population to the Spanish flu, and more recently, with a measles outbreak, a number of small children were lost because of the pressures of this disease. So they shut their borders tightly and very successfully, frankly. Of the 12 countries without COVID, 10 are in this region. But then more tragedy hit. 2 weeks after shutting their border, a Category 5 cyclone hit 4 of these countries. And Erin, we can just have a look at that devastation. It's similar all around the world, but you can see whole villages were flattened. Lives were lost, millions of dollars of damage. And then they had the really unenviable decision of what to do. Do we lock the borders down entirely? So Erin, we can go to the picture of Vanuatu if you can go to the next slide. Do we allow humanitarian assistance to come in as we always have? And if we do that, they could bring COVID in, which is exactly what they didn't want. Or we keep the borders shut tightly and draw on our local and international, our regional international networks. We can get aid dropped off at the airports, but we will do it all. So this is localization in action, exactly. And that's what they decided to do. In partnership with regional, international, and national governments, they set up the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway. You can see there, they've used their local airlines in this instance to deliver, to get aid, to bring it in. This is medical aid, food aid, shelter aid, but not the people. So this is dropped off. And if the international NGOs wanted to help out and the donors, they had to do it through local systems. So Erin, we can finish with the slides now. You get a sense of what has happened here. So what we now have happening is exactly what the World Humanitarian Summit and all the evaluations of many disasters have said, that we have to move to a more localized response. Well, this is innovation out of adversity, no choice. You would have to now use the local systems, and they have been using local systems in response to the cyclone as well as the COVID pandemic. They had to be more inclusive now because you needed, in order to do your rapid assessments, to use your local networks to get the evaluations done and the information back to the center. And furthermore, you had to have genuine partnerships because now the international NGOs and the aid agencies needed local networks and needed the national governments to deliver the aid. The whole system didn't collapse, and we know through the Caribbean assessments, African assessments, we often get complaints that you can't use local systems because the logistical networks are so poor. So you just come in and you basically, in many cases, take over to do the distribution. Well, something different had to happen here because you had to use the local logistics. And so you had to come up beside them. And so there were remote assistance on how to do the logistical distributions. There was advice on policing, on defense, in order to manage the pressures that were building in these countries. And of course, there was a total change in financial flows because it wasn't going to be controlled by the people on the ground. Some of the agencies like Red Cross had locally engaged offices there. But nonetheless, more money had to flow through the local systems and be managed by the local systems, even if that was cash transfers. And in many cases, like Australia, because COVID was now interacting with a cyclone, there was much more budget support than we would normally do, because you had to maintain basic important services, health clinics, etc. And that had to go through the governments. Even the processes that we're all familiar with, the cluster system, which often has international NGOs and national governments getting the rapid assessments, deciding what would be the priorities. Well, all of a sudden, there was more of the local NGOs involved in those discussions right from the beginning, because they would be needed to distribute and they would be needed to do the assessments. So when our college is working across 3 of these countries and doing interviews on what happened, the locals have assessed this as one of the best, most decentralized humanitarian interventions yet, because they had their voices more at the table and could be shaping the response more strongly. There were less players, the system was less overwhelmed, yet they were still getting support, but just in a different way that was more in keeping with the systems that were already on the ground and that they needed to strengthen. So you had a less fragmented system going on. And in the words of one disaster manager, and I'm quoting now, "Was this an ideal humanitarian response meeting the needs of all vulnerable people? No, of course not. But was it better than previous cyclone responses? Definitely." And I think that's important, that there is this improvement going on and learning of new ways that you can respond. And it goes to the evaluations, whether it's in Philippines, in Haiti, in Africa, where we talk about a need for localizations, clear communications, and involving the local people. Now we had an example, not by planning, almost by necessity, where some of this was occurring. There was also interesting reflections on how the power dynamics were changing and expectations were changing. So obviously power dynamics are changing because there was a need to engage local systems and to leverage them up. But also out in the rural areas that were affected, both by the cyclone, the expectations were lower that there was going to be international assistance. So they began to look at, well, how do they help themselves, and how do they leverage chiefly systems, for instance, that could then connect to women's groups, to church groups. So when there were shortfalls, and it was not a perfect response, still isn't, there's still people 4 months later waiting for help. But what they started to do was get these local networks of communities that weren't affected by the cyclone and had excess food to transfer it into the islands where it was needed. And same with shelter in terms of the palm leaves that could be used and the wood, etc. So you had communities helping communities. And then there's the irony that when evaluated, the food aid was more diverse, more in keeping with what would normally be eaten, and more nutritious because it was the root crops and the food that was available from these villages when it occurred and when they could get it in. So the Humanitarian Advisory Group, which is like a research group of the humanitarian agencies in Australia, did an independent review of this response and a lessons learned. And I love their subtitle of their report, which is "No Turning Back." And really what they're concluding is, now that we've seen how these systems can work, there is going to now be more affirmative and a smarter sovereignty being imposed by these countries to say, yes, we need these networks and we need you to assist us in these times of crisis. But there is a different way of doing this, and we've proved it can work now. So we want to use these more hybrid systems to move ourselves forward, and these partnerships that are more respectful of the local systems, and build them up so that they're not only working in a crisis, they can continue to work during a development well, in between the crises when you're trying to advance development. So interestingly, just to give you a concept, the transformation that was occurring in this, when interviewed, 74% of international organizations stated that there had been an increase in remote support to national counterparts. So they were trying to build the capacity to deliver the assistance and doing it through relying and building up their local counterparts. We also had a much better use of information technology, which is part of a trend with or without this kind of intervention. But the data that had to be collected to do the rapid assessment, some of that's through satellite and aerial surveillance, but it could be analyzed overseas, but that analysis beamed back into the country for them to take action. So we see some really interesting partnerships and different kinds of networks evolving there. We had central governments tasking local governments in a way they never had to get out and do the rapid assessment and send that information back. We had the Red Cross that has been working in these countries for a long time. They couldn't send in their teams, but they could leverage their connections to the village headmen and the councils to get the information again, to try and get a grounded view of what was happening on the ground in these villages. So then the analysis was there was far better contextual knowledge because the people collecting it knew place and were able to leverage different kinds of networks so for a more inclusive response. Often we refer to these as, well, there were emergent groups, you know, the women's groups, the church groups, the chiefly groups that helped us respond. And what we wanted to say in the discussions is these are not emergent groups. These groups have always been there. In fact, they've been there since before some of these formal governments, which are part of a colonial intervention. It's just that we haven't figured out ways to engage them and bring them into a response as effectively as they could. And this is where we can see some movement and transformation in this situation. We also get the assessment by the locals that this time there was a much tighter fit between needs analysis and response, because the needs analysis was more influenced by those on the ground feeding the information up. Finally, with this concept of getting that tighter fit between disaster response and then moving into a developmental phase and letting the two feed off of each other. What we could do with social protection is not only work with cash transfers, not only work with more payments through disability or social protection mechanisms. When we asked what made a difference in the recovery, a lot of it was not about getting aid to individuals. It was about supporting the development processes of communities. So some of the communities that responded the most quickly were those that had savings groups. And in the words of one of the women, we simply did our own economic stimulus. They took that 5,000 US, which is what they had saved over many years, and they bought seeds and they bought petrol to get to the markets or to get to the cities to get the supplies that they needed. Those that had seen cyclones before and had localized seed banks were able to also quickly replenish their gardens. Those that had had investment in critical infrastructure could use that again in their recovery. So just to wrap up, what this shows is we can do localization better. We can do our partnerships better, and we can leverage from the international down to the national, out to the local, the networks, and get them, making them more complementary and have these hybrid responses that can have very good outcomes if we have a commitment to change. So in the future, what we're looking for is taking these examples, sometimes born out of adversity, and thinking of ways of how do we learn from that so that we get different types of actions. So returning to the title, can disaster interventions be development innovations? I think certainly they can. And we could do more to support them so we get these diverse networks happening, and better channels of support. So it's really just a matter of not waiting for a crisis to do better, to listen to ourselves in our evaluations, and to connect to the people to think about each time, how do we improve? Thank you. I'm back to you, Ronak.
Yeah, no, Meg, that was wonderful. This speaks to a lot of the language that we've been using in humanitarian practice, but not actualizing. And so it's very encouraging to know that in the face of compounding crises like these, in a situation where we thought the usual standard of practice wouldn't work, that what we've gone now to, at least in these examples you gave, are situations where we can actually actualize those ideals and things that we talked about for so long for the last decade in localization. So, brings to me mind several examples and even some questions I have, but I don't want to be selfish. That we already have a few comments showing up in the chat box that I want to just relay to you. So as we talk, everybody else that's listening in and watching, please join in with your questions and examples as you have them, and we'll bring them up. But we have a very good one from Dima El Sayed, who brings up the fact that why call these innovations, right? This localization, the fact that there should be these partnerships, that there shouldn't be a heavy hand of the international system, should be the standard of practice, right? That these localized responses we've known through lessons and evidence work better and should be more well suited. Is there a concern that, once this pandemic is over, that we revert back to the old ways of doing things, right? And I bring up this fact because of even the language that we used in that very nice ODI report, the time to let go, right? There are perverse incentives that drive the humanitarian system to function the way it is, not alone, let alone the financial incentives that exist. What are the chances we go back to, business as usual, and how do we prevent that?
Yeah, and I think this is the real risk because, for instance, in this area of the world, when the country's not locked down, everybody can come in and take over again. Money speaks, and those that come in with the money can certainly influence. Having said that, I think if we look at COVID-19 and we're all working from home, doing things differently, once you see a different way that things can be done and you learn to work from home and run a college of a dozen or more people from home, you start to look, well, where did that help me? Where did it help? Where was there win-wins that we can just stay with?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this example does show some win-wins. It was not as labor intensive for these organizations. The communication systems that supported remotely are now in place and can be leveraged up again. The different channels to funnel money that everybody was very nervous about because of the sort of things David Sanderson was talking about, and corruption does happen, and local biasing and patronage happens. But there are now some new systems in place, and I think there's also, the worry was always that the whole system would collapse if you only depended on local logistics. And once you see that, well, actually, that didn't work too badly, and there were problems. I'm giving up the positives. There were problems, but those can be fixed, and we can work better together. I also think the cluster system that had, at least in this area of the world, included as strongly local NGOs won't go back because they've been involved. So will we go totally back to where we were? I think not. Will we repeat this story that I've told you of full-on localization? No. And it probably isn't the ideal way to go. It will be some hybrid, some middle ground. And what's important is the people whose countries this is are firm about what worked well for them, and they hold on to it. And the things that were challenging and fell down, well, they might have to have a different way of approaching. But I don't think we will slide totally back to exactly the way it was. It's in no one's interest to do so.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of thinking about it. It makes me think that, like the commenter mentioned, this is nothing new, and you're bringing up these things that have been pre-existing. You mentioned these, councils in the villages that just weren't empowered previously or leveraged to their full capacity that they can be now. They've existed, and the examples I was thinking of just now were, during the Ebola outbreak. In Monrovia, there was very strong urban farming and urban rural food linkages that helped support the food security of that environment when there wasn't the standard practice that we could use, because it was a similar situation in which access was limited because of that. There wasn't as much of that outside force that we would expect. Neighboring Sierra Leone and Freetown, similarly during the Civil War, a lot of that for food security came from, reinforcing those pre-existing things that were there. It's something that I've seen a lot in the Food for Cities listserv, if you've ever been a part of that through the FAO, and working on these urban farming examples as a way to build resilience locally. And then you have supply chains that are local and logistics that can be supported, right after crisis, that then reinforce what's already in play. Again, during the development phase, making them stronger, that can serve that purpose during a crisis. So
and that's what we're finding all around, is that we don't map them out. We had a different project with fisheries, just saying, where do the fish come from and how do they get to the city? And then you see the fact that we have very little cold storage out into the villages. We don't have robust transportation systems between islands, which is what we needed in order to move food assistance aid around internally within the government. Within the country. And so then in between crises, you can think about, well, how do you do that better? And this is where I think it's really interesting. If the gardens in the city, for instance, they've been going down in these urban areas as they rapidly urbanize, and now we see the value of them. We see the value of the linkages from the urban to the peri-urban to the rural. They've been shutting down the community-based markets because of problems with sanitation and water. But now they realize that the better solution is to get the sanitation and water to those community markets, not bring everybody into the center. So there's a number of rethinks. And in the talk, I also talked about seed banks that are dispersed. And that works whether it's drought, cyclone, or you just need some extra seeds in a good season. They've also got solar dehydrators so that you can store food for tough times, but you can also transport it more easily and sell it in markets as a novelty. So there's all these things that work well in crisis, but also support development long-term. And the more we can start really thinking about these, they add to resilience over time, short-term, medium-term, long-term. That's what we want to move towards.
Yeah, I think it's right that you emphasize that, the advocacy that's going to have to be done, by these, localities exercising their sovereignty, in a good way, that, shows that they just can't be pushed around, and that, there's a bank of evidence and lessons in history from a lot of development practice that can be used, but it's really about the structure of that response. And again, like you said, from all of those linkages. We have another question from Dimitri, and he's trying to draw a thread between several of the webinars we've had through this series, and going back to one of the points you mentioned, and it's a point that I've brought up in classes before, and that you talked about there was a little bit of hesitation initially in going towards this localized response because of concerns about corruption and transparency within local systems, and how that was negated and it was still worked fairly well. We've had the same issues come up as people tried to push back against cash transfer programs, right? Often this is the typical criticism. It's rooted in a lot of misconceptions, and actually I think rooted in some colonialism and racism that we've talked about as being engendered into the humanitarian system as well. So his question is really about this evaluation that you brought up from Vanuatu. Was there an evaluation of the transparency and effectiveness that really looked at those things to see how it compared to previous responses?
I think we're only 4 or 5 months, and there's fatigue in these places. But there are some interesting stories about this. And one was because there were so few people, you couldn't put whole teams in villages. and you were getting the rapid assessments and all that, and that has the risks of patronage and MPs serving their own people or those that vote for them, but not others. But what they did is they put one person from the national council out into the rural area. So it's only one. And they were there as a support to the local region. But it also happened to be a check on the system. And that this was their point, that it brought in accountability because the national person was there in a support. They weren't running the show, but they were seeing how things were being distributed, and it was just a deterrent, I suppose, to bad behavior. The other thing that's really interesting is they've been trialing these community disaster and climate change committees, but basically local groups. And the local groups, unlike the national groups, have women's representatives, and we have a real problem with gender bias interventions. So the women are on these localized groups, youth, different people in the community. And that too doesn't stop corruption. It puts a check on it because it makes more visible to more people what's going on. So sometimes if you can get hybrid solutions, because we talked about in David's talk that corruption doesn't just happen at the local level. Corruption can happen with the international NGOs, frankly, and then soft power biases occur by donors. So you've got problems up and down the system. And the only way to deal with it is to put some light on what's going on with people with different agendas and interests. And so if we can use this process to embed different people in local and national and international operations, it does bring a little bit more accountability and transparency. I would agree with Dimitri. It certainly needs some more rigorous analysis. When all is done and dusted, we can take a breath and really go in and do some in-depth interviews about how people experienced this. But similarly with putting a check, because I like to look upwards than downwards on corruption by international NGOs or soft power used by donors, if they've got to put it through a national system and a local NGO, that also balances things a little bit. So it's an interesting way. And I think, Ronak, you made a really good point about, we always thought cash transfers would be disastrous. And it's not that they don't have problems, but they have been proven to be quite effective actually in an emergency situation where you're trying to get money out and meet needs. So sometimes I think we have to have a more clear-eyed evaluation of these and not bring our assumptions and our biases without evidence to the table. So we definitely, Dimitri, need good research, good evidence, and to see what's happened. But I actually don't think it will be much different and hopefully a little bit better than in the past.
Yeah. So we were getting questions here, I'll just jump into them. Iman asks, working for a humanitarian organization, the challenge that she's had is in monitoring that field level activity, the local activity, because a lot of times it may not meet the standards that have been set in place by the humanitarian community, which goes to that other question that we were discussing even before, Meg, about the local capacity, so that it's nice to use that, but what about in situations where that local capacity or expertise isn't quite there to make sure that we can meet the standards that Iman talks about? How do we get around that type of challenge?
And I think you've got to acknowledge where the capacity is not there, but what are you going to do about it? Simply replacing the system is not the solution. And I'll give one example from Solomon Islands. They wanted to have localized rapid assessments, but you have the problem of, will the people know what to do? And will we get apples and oranges coming in so we can't assess it? So bring in technology. They have this thing called the Kobo toolbox. That just means on a handheld phone, you have a set of questions that you ask and you type in the answer, and satellite's working, zooms back to a central agency. So you're not saying the locals can't do it, but you're backing them up with a way to do it that is accessible. So I think you just got to keep thinking, how are you going about this? in where I work, and I'm sure a lot of people that are listening, local governments struggle. They don't have enough people, they don't have capability. In some of the places I work, in the cities, they don't even have their own urban planner. They've got to rely on the national government's urban planner. So, okay, absolutely, man, capacity is low here. But then you got to think about, well, what are you doing about it? Can you come beside them? Which was this concept that happened with the Pacific humanitarian corridor pathway. Could you do remote assistance? Can you talk about how to do logistics, how to ask questions, what sort of data should be coming back? And then not assuming that the only system is the formal system. And I think this was also coming out, is that you go to these local areas and the local government really is going to be beyond doing some of this stuff. But the chiefs and the churches, and they're very strong in the Pacific and very well networked, might be able to help or tell you who can help you. So this goes to something that comes up in the humanitarian literature about sometimes you got to take a bit more time to make these things work. They're not going to run on a tight time frame because I'm there for 2 weeks and going out. So it all has to be done in that time. But we have to look at, if you don't have capacity, how do you build capacity? How can you complement it? Is there a hybrid solution here? And are there other facilities or groups in the region that you can pull on to help? Can you train up a university little network that goes out and goes around and helps? Can you do analysis of the data being collected elsewhere, but sending it back because there isn't the capacity to do so? So I just think it comes back to this. It isn't a matter of if something doesn't work, you bring in your own system. It's a matter of, so what are we going to do about it? What's creative? What's interesting? How do we move forward to support the system? Because you won't be there in the long run, but the local government will, the churches will, the women's groups will. So taking over isn't going to be a long-term solution. Sometimes we do it to save lives. Absolutely understand that, has to be done. But we still have to think critically in the long run how we're engaging.
Yeah. That brings up that next pillar and what we're talking about in terms of changes to the architecture, right? We talked about sovereignty and exercising our sovereignty. That changes some of the standard of practice, the financing and how direct that is to the local NGOs and populations rather than channeled through others. And then timeline, right? So a lot of the answer to that question was about, it just takes time. It can't be that it can be rushed and you can expect that and then all of a sudden go back to your usual practice. And so timelines need to change in our thinking of how we do standard practice. You mentioned churches and chiefs, and so we have a question that dovetailed nicely into that. And Alexei is asking about not just some of these localized responses, but the uptake of more traditional or long-term strategies that have pre-existed, that have been working well for people in development timeframes to build back better after a crisis. Beyond just the urban farming, but things like traditional roofing and structures, reinforcement of some of those governance structures that used to be traditional but were disempowered, like you said, the villages and the chief structures. How do you see that developing or evolving in these situations as well?
I don't think we have a choice, and that's what this showed. And as I said, when we couldn't get the food aid and the shelter aid to these places, the local systems just couldn't work fast enough. That's where they were shipping over the palms that were for the roofing. But what we need to do is build on it, work together. What are the local structures that are using local wood and palms, et cetera, that withstand these practices? Some work at the University of Melbourne, when they tracked what happened in a crisis, they go to the caves because the caves will withstand the cyclone. Well, then when you're doing your trial evacuations and you're teaching people, when the alarm goes off, where do you go? The school is not always the best place, frankly, especially when the school is right by a coastal environment and vulnerable. So we learn about these things, the storing of how you store seeds, how you store root crops for rapid recovery, and supporting it, not saying, oh, well, you don't want those. They're not the most resilient, climate resilient crops, so just don't bother. So there is a lot of knowledge. We have found when we look at what communities are resilient and not after a crisis, those that have lived in place for generations have oral stories they've passed down about how do you read what's happening before a tsunami or a cyclone, and they actually do let it better, and less lives are lost in those communities than the immigrant communities. And they may have immigrated a generation ago, and they may be from the South Pacific, Kiribati over to Solomon Islands or whatever, but those communities do less well. So how do we capture those stories, that traditional knowledge, and make use of it? Because we're not always going to have, it's the old thing. It's nice to have a Rolls Royce, but when you don't have it, let's understand the Volkswagen and get it working. And so this traditional knowledge, it's very strong in the Pacific, as it is in other places, of saying, just recognize that, as someone said to me in Vanuatu, it's not like cyclones came with colonialism, Meg. We've been dealing with cyclones since we settled this place. We do have ways to think about it, and these traditional ways of responding. Some work well, some not, and we need to evolve them, but we could evolve things together and not just chuck it out. So I think with Alexi's point, that's really important. And in this case, it showed that the chiefs were able to leverage the women's group and the church group to get food and shelter aid to places where the formal governance system could not have done it without them. That's the reality. So why would you not use that as well? And if you're with the international NGOs or the donors intervention, we have to find ways to better understand that process and better use our locally engaged staff to tap into it, because we could reach more people faster and more efficiently if we made use of those traditional networks more effectively.
Yeah, it brings to mind the fact that lives in vulnerable populations. And so sometimes some of the concern is that by working in this localized response, right, there's always some good and bad. We're not meaning to say that the international system is completely flawed and localization is some romantic ideal. That oftentimes in these places, there's marginalized populations that are hyper vulnerable and vulnerable to the pre-existing structures and governance and norms that are there, right? So how do we make sure that we don't reinforce some of that in marginalization and vulnerability? And it might be by gender, it might be by ethnic group, it might be a language group. I'll admit freely that in some of my research, I've failed to understand some of that context when we were doing a water sanitation intervention in an urban slum in Mumbai, and we realized a little late that one of the groups that was in the community-based organization was dominating that conversation, and they were all from one language group. And so we had to make sure that we weren't led astray by not having enough contextual knowledge. So I think you're right in that we need to leverage the expertise of local staff to make sure that in these situations, we don't reinforce some of those things, right? Did you find any examples of that?
Well, I think that's true. And I also wanted to go back to sometimes the value of international interventions is they reveal these biases in the system that make people vulnerable. And the example of that is the gender biases that occur in both the international but national and localized interventions. So, with the calamity in Aceh, they found that 70% of the deaths were amongst women because they take the care roles, because they were less mobile. So when we see this in a local system, we can build different kinds of responses to deal with those gendered impacts of these extreme events. So I think, I think that was a really important point, that no one, including these countries, are saying we want localization and there's nothing good from international NGOs. Of course not. That's why they did the Pacific Pathway. That's why they wanted that engagement. So I think this is really important, that we work together. We have the hybrid systems. We learn from each other. We question each other's systems to make for better outcomes. It's not going to be one or the other. It's not an either or. It's not a black or white. That's not going to get us the most resilient outcomes. It's how we pull these systems together. There are always biases. People in power will always protect the status quo because that's what got them into power. And they will always channel assistance and development in a way that will reinforce their power base. That is always going to happen. It's tribalism, it's human nature. The chiefs would do the same. So it is taking that critical look at it. And the only way you reveal that is through inclusion, really, trying to involve these different groups. The really good example, which internationally we're coming at, is we really haven't done disability well. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people with disabilities in these communities, whether it's cities, rural areas, and they're not consulted. They're not integrated into a response. We don't even know how some of these calamities or development initiatives impact upon them until they're included in the discussions and involved, and we listen. Both the local tribal chiefly systems as well as the international systems start to listen to say, well, what are we going to do to better meet the needs of the children, the women, the disabled, the people living in formal settlements? I mean, that's a classic and well run with informality in the cities. You can't fix it if you don't talk to the people that live in those places. And so that's what we're looking at. And it's, that's well worn. We know that. But this is where this concept of hybridity and convergence of systems starts to evolve the system. And that's what adaptive management is all about. And transformation is letting the feedback mechanisms tell you what needs to be done from all systems.
Well, we're nearing the end of our time, and we want to be mindful of everybody else's time, and especially the awkward time that we place this webinar specifically. What I'll do is just let you have some final thoughts. And, I was actually curious, given everything that you talked about, and thank you for such an insightful discussion. Where are you taking your work in the next couple of years that this recent conversation just brought you to?
Yeah, well, I was heading up an urbanization in the Pacific in Melanesia project and looking at many of these issues. But right now with the college, we're really interested in this issue of resilience and not bounding it only to the cities, but the connections between rural urban areas. And because we have this this horrible example, but also one that we can learn from, of COVID, and with lockdown borders and with cyclones happening and the strong localized response. So we have people in locally engaged staff in all three of those places, interviewing across national governments, international NGOs, and local communities about sort of triangulation. How did people see it? What was good? What wasn't good? Trying to get their own stories captured so that they can tell their stories of what went on. And that will be on our website. So the blogs that come out, but also what I was trying to encourage people here to do is share your stories so that people can learn from each other. And that's what we're trying to do, and get governments talking to each other through Zoom like this, about how they responded, what worked, what they want to insist upon in the future, and then bring in that particular project has very strong representation of the international NGO groups, because that's about this feedback loop. If this is what's being said locally, what does that mean for changing your practice? What are you going to do about it? And so we're trying to broker that discussions so we don't lose this moment in time. We take advantage of it and we learn. And so that's one of our projects that we're pretty excited about. But I'm sure a lot of this is going on all around the world. And so if we can find ways to share that practice, that would be really valuable.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Meg, for a wonderful discussion, and thanks to the audience for tuning in not only to this webinar, but making the entire series incredibly successful. We've had hundreds of live viewers and thousands of views of our recordings. So obviously your interaction questions have really made these series lively and far richer than we could have done with just a simple back and forth discussion or podcast. So we're really grateful to the audience that we've had here. Like you said, Meg, we'd love to keep this discussion going. So whether it's through that website where people can see that report, or more importantly, through that conference that I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, the Urban Resilience in Asia Pacific Conference, that is now registration free and will take place December 3rd and 4th. And so a lot of these issues and topics and all of the speakers will be there to engage on these issues and hopefully through some panels and engaged discussions. So please join us for that when you can. Again, the link will be there. But thank you, everybody. And I want to thank the team in the background at HHI that has really helped us put this together. So Erin Van Leesten and Katie Farenow have put together, the awesome webinar that you're seeing now, including the graphics, the logistics, the technology, guiding us through, baby steps on how to make this work. And so the success credit goes to all of them for the logistics. But again, thank you, everybody. And hopefully we'll start a new series that we can continue all of this conversation through.
Thank you.